Hey everyone, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to get back into Success Through Positive Mental Attitude, Chapter 19, which is called Get Rid of That Guilt Feeling. You have a guilt feeling? That's good. But get rid of that feeling of guilt. A sense of guilt is good, and every living person, regardless of how good or bad he may be, will sometimes experience a feeling of guilt. This feeling is the result of a still small voice speaking to you, and your conscience is that still small voice. Now think for a moment, what would happen if one did not feel a sense of guilt after doing wrong? For the person who does not have a feeling of guilt for doing a specific wrong act is often unable to distinguish between right and wrong, or hasn't been trained to know the difference between right and wrong as regards to that act. Or he may not be sane. For many feelings of guilt are inherited, and others are acquired. We know a mental conflict often will develop when inherited emotions and passions are bridled by the society in which one lives, and people in one environment may have an entirely different code of ethics that is opposed to the code of those in another. Yet in each instance where the individual has been taught a specific ethical standard and violates it, he develops a feeling of guilt. In some instances, however, the violation of a moral standard of society is good because the standard itself may be bad. And we reiterate, a feeling of guilt is good. It often motivates persons of the highest moral standards to worthwhile thought of an action. For there was a righteous man who hated and unrelentingly persecuted people of a religious minority, but he developed a feeling of guilt. And the world knows he righted his wrong when his feelings of guilt motivated him to desirable action. For he became a great evangelist, and his thoughts, words, and actions have changed the history of the world during the past 2,000 years. Saul of Tarsus was his name. And then there was a man whose feelings of guilt for what he believed to be the misdeeds of his life made him so remorseful that he too was motivated to desirable action. In prison, he spent his days writing a book, and his book is a classic reference for teaching nobility of character and beauty of life. John Bunyan was his name. And then there was also the sinner we discussed in chapter 15 who donated $500,000 to the Chicago Boys Clubs, who also donated $1 million to his church. Now, he did this to atone in part for his guilt, for he provided money to prevent boys and girls from falling into the traps and snares of life that he had experienced. Even a benefactor to mankind like Dr. Albert Schweitzer was motivated by the sense of guilt, for he felt guilty that he had fallen short of his responsibilities to his fellow men. And because he could, but was not doing something worthwhile, his sense of guilt prompted him to start his great mission. Now do you see that a feeling of guilt with PMA is good? But then there is a feeling of guilt with NMA, and that is bad. For not every guilt feeling brings about beneficial results. Now, when the individual has a guilt feeling and does not get rid of that guilt feeling with PMA, the results are often most harmful. And the great psychologist Sigmund Freud says, the further our work proceeds and the deeper our knowledge of the mental life of neurotics penetrates, the more clearly two new factors force themselves upon our notice which demand the closest attention as sources of resistance. They can both be included under the one description of need to be ill or need to suffer. The first of these two factors is the sense of guilt or consciousness of guilt. And Sigmund Freud is right, for feelings of guilt have motivated men to destroy their lives, mutilate their bodies, or injure themselves in other ways to atone for their wrongdoing. Now today, fortunately, such methods are seldom practiced, and they are not permitted in civilized countries. Yet their counterpart can be found, for the conscious mind may not feel guilty, but the subconscious mind does. And the subconscious mind never forgets, and it uses its powers as effectively as the conscious mind. For it fulfills the need of the individual who doesn't rid himself of the feeling of guilt with PMA. It makes him ill. It makes him suffer. A guilt feeling can teach you consideration for others. Consideration for others is a quality each of us has to learn to develop. The newborn babe cares little for the comfort and convenience of anyone else. He wants what he wants when he wants it. So right at that point in his development, he begins to learn little by little that there are others alive too, and that, to some extent at least, he will have to allow them some consideration. But selfishness is a common human trait, and it lessens in each of us only through development. When we get old enough to understand that such feelings are not good, we feel a twinge of guilt when we indulge in selfishness. This is good, for it causes us to think twice when the occasion arises, and we can choose between pleasing ourselves or pleasing others concerned. Thomas Gunn's 6-year-old grandson was visiting him at his home in Cleveland, Ohio. The youngster would run to the corner every evening to meet his grandfather when he returned from work. This made the grandfather very happy. When the youngster met him, he would give his grandson a small bag of candy. One day, the boy ran to the corner and greeted his grandfather in excitement and anticipation with, "Where's my candy?" The elderly gentleman tried to conceal his emotion. "Did you meet me every evening?" He hesitated before continuing, "just for a bag of candy?" The boy was handed the small bag that his grandfather had taken out of his pocket. Nothing more was said as they walked to the house. The child was hurt. He was unhappy. He didn't eat the candy. It didn't seem desirable anymore. He had just injured someone whom he loved. That night, as the 6-year-old and his grandfather knelt down and said their prayers aloud together, the youngster added one all his own. "Please God, let grandfather know I love him." The boy's unhappiness and remorse because of what he had done were good. Why? Because they forced him to take action to get rid of that guilt feeling and make amends for what he had done. To get rid of that guilt feeling, make amends. Feelings of guilt can arise from many varied causes, but a sense of guilt brings with it a feeling of indebtedness that must be reduced and eliminated. And this is very well illustrated by the story of the young doctor in Lloyd C. Douglas's novel, The Magnificent Obsession. For you will recall that in that story, the young man, who is the hero, felt that he owed the world a debt because his life had been saved at the cost of the life of a great brain surgeon who had been a real blessing to the world. But it was this feeling of debt which caused the young man to become a brain specialist equal in ability to the man whose life he felt he had taken. And from the diary of the man who had gone on, the young man learned a philosophy of life which caused him to develop a magnificent obsession. Thus, because of his guilt feeling, he too became a worthwhile person. Now, every story is somebody's story. And every day in your daily newspaper, you read somebody's story. Someone like Jim Vouse, whose life was saved in more ways than one because he responded to an irrevocable decision to get rid of his feeling of guilt, for he got into action. To get rid of that guilt feeling, get into action. Sometimes people get caught in a web of wrongdoing, and they seem to be unable to free themselves from it, for they give up trying. And then they become more and more entangled, until finally it takes an almost earth-shaking experience to set them free. Such was the case with Jim Vouse. Jim Vouse is a man who literally owes his life to his decision to say, "I will," and yet this decision came quite late in life. For a good many years, Jim had been running head-on into the commandments. He seemed to be trying to violate them all, one by one. The first time he broke the injunction, "Thou shalt not steal." He was still in college. One day he stole $92.74. He went to the airport, bought a ticket, and headed for Florida. A little later he stole again, this time in an armed robbery. He was caught and put in jail. Shortly thereafter, he was granted amnesty so that he could join the army. Yet even in the army he got in trouble. The court-martial read for diverting government property to private use. And so it went. Jim Vouse's career kept sliding downhill. The more often he did wrong, the more guilt he felt. Guilt leads to guilt, as well as lies and deception to hide it. Now Jim didn't consciously feel more guilty, because his conscious sense of guilt had become deadened. But not so with his subconscious mind. For that's where the guilt feeling accumulated without Jim's realizing it. And as in the instances you often read of in your newspaper, it took an earth-shaking experience to awaken him. Now Vouse was eventually released from the army. He remarried and moved to California, where he set up an electronics consultant business. One day, a man known simply as Andy came to Jim and outlined a big idea for beating the races with an electronic device. Within weeks, Jim was deeply involved with the underworld, and he was driving a $9,000 car. He had a fine home in the suburbs and more business than he could handle. One day, Jim had an argument with his wife. She wanted to know where all the money was coming from, and he wouldn't say. So she started to cry. Jim couldn't stand to see his wife cry, for he loved her. Jim's conscience bothered him. Because he wanted to humor her, he suggested a ride out to the beach. On the way, they got caught in a traffic jam. Hundreds of cars were pouring into a parking lot. "Oh, look, Jim," said Alice, "it's Billy Graham. Let's go. It might be interesting." And still trying to humor her, Jim went along. But shortly after he sat down, he became emotionally disturbed. It seemed to him that Graham was talking directly to him. For Jim's conscience bothered him so badly that it seemed that he had been singled out. Graham's text was, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?" Then Graham was saying, "There's a man here who has heard all this before, who has hardened his heart. If with pride he stiffens his neck, and he is determined to leave without making a decision. But this will be his last chance." His last chance? To Jim, the thought was startling. Perhaps he had a premonition, or perhaps he was ready. What did the preacher mean? Graham was given a call to come forward. He wanted people to take a physical step that symbolized a decision. What was happening, Jim wondered. Why did he feel like crying? Suddenly, he found himself speaking. "Let's go, Alice." Dutifully, Alice walked to the aisle and turned as if to go out of the tent. Jim, who was following her, caught her arm and turned her around. "No, dear," he said, "this way." Years later, after Jim had changed his life completely, he was giving a speech in Los Angeles, and then he told of his experiences with the underworld. He told about the day of his decision, on which day he had been instructed to fly to St. Louis on a wiretapping assignment. "I never reached St. Louis," he said. "I found the courage to reach my knees instead." And in his speech, Jim told of his blessings and how he had thanked God for them, asked for forgiveness, had tried to neutralize his wrongdoing, and stressed the application of the Golden Rule. After the lecture, a lady came up to him and said, "Mr. Vouse, I think you might like to know something. I was working in the mayor's office at the time you were supposed to go to St. Louis. On that day, a teletype was received from the FBI. It said, Mr. Vouse, that you were going to be met in St. Louis by a rival gang and shot dead. A recommended formula for getting rid of guilt. Your own last chance may not be as dramatic as this, but there is a wonderful lesson in the story of Jim Vouse, nonetheless. How was Jim able to get rid of his guilt feelings? He did it by following a clear-cut pattern. It is the pattern all of us can follow. First of all, you listen as you hear advice, a lecture, an inspirational sermon that could change your life. Then you count your blessings and thank God for them. Feel sincerely sorry and ask for forgiveness. When you realize your blessings, it isn't difficult to become sincerely sorry for the wrongs you have done, and truly to repent. Then you will have the courage to ask for forgiveness from God. You must take the first step forward. This is important because it is a symbol through a physical gesture that you make in the direction of a changed life. When Jim walked down the aisle, he was making a public announcement that he had become sorry for his past and was now ready to change his life. Also, you must make amends by taking the second step forward. Begin immediately to right every wrong. And then the most important step of all, apply the golden rule. This should be easy, for now when you are tempted to do wrong, that still small voice will whisper to you. And when it does, stop and listen. Count your blessings. Picture yourself in the other fellow's place, and then make your decision to do what you would want done if you actually were in his position. So this is the formula for getting rid of your guilt feelings. If you are having trouble with temptation, and if subsequent guilt is keeping you from using your energy in a constructive direction, learn the pattern for freedom from guilt. Relate it to your own life, apply it, and step away toward success. Success through a positive mental attitude urges you to use the powers of your conscious and subconscious mind to seek the truth, motivate you to take constructive action, cause you to strive to achieve the highest ideals you can conceive, consistent with good physical and mental health, live intelligently in your society, help you abstain from that which will cause unnecessary injury, and start you from where you are and get you to where you want to be, regardless of what you are or what you have been. Anything which deters you from noble achievements in life should be cast aside, and this places upon you the burden to know or find out what is wrong or right or wrong. and to know what is good or evil under a given circumstance and at a given time. You are acquainted with the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and other standards of good in the society in which you live. And it is for you to determine the standards which will guide you to your desired goals. It is one thing to know the goal, and quite another thing to work towards it. Writes Bishop Fulton J. Sheen in Life is Worth Living. Choose your goals. Work toward them. Direct your thoughts, control your emotions, get into action, and you ordain your destiny. You can find the answer if you keep seeking it. How? One important aid is to catch character. Character is something that is caught, not taught, was a thought-provoking quotation of Arthur Berger, former executive director of the Boys Club of Boston. It appeared in a Reader's Digest article entitled 400,000 Boys Are Members of the Club. Catch has two different distinct meanings. One, affected by exposure to environment, often subconscious reaction, and two, seize and hold, conscious action. One effective way to catch character is to place yourself or your children in an environment that will develop desirable thoughts, motives, and habits. If your selected environment is not sufficiently effective after a reasonable time, make substitutions and changes. But character can also be taught, and if parents would devote more time to teaching character, both by precept and example, their children would catch and learn this admirable quality so necessary for success. What makes a delinquent? E. Bauermeister, former supervisor of education at the California Institution for Men at Chino, California, says, our youngsters need the guidance in choosing right from wrong, which they should receive at home. When we start talking about juvenile delinquency, we should rename it and put the responsibility where it belongs. We have a case of parent delinquency in America today. Parents are not assuming the obligations and responsibilities that are theirs. Everyone has been born with the potential of good character. J. Edgar Hoover made this statement. You can read volumes upon volumes as to the cause of crime, but crime is literally caused by the lack of one thing, a feeling of moral responsibility on the part of people. And the reason the people lack a feeling of moral responsibility is because they lack a feeling of guilt. Thus, they do not develop their own characters, for their conscience is dulled and doesn't guide them. And from their faulty, immoral, and amoral characters, their children can neither catch nor learn character. When one virtue is in conflict with another, sometimes it is not easy to decide whether one should say yes or no, for the question to be resolved may involve a conflict between virtues. And every person at some time is faced with such a conflict and must make a decision. He must choose between that which he wishes to do and what he ought to do, or between what he wants and what society expects of him. And such a choice must necessarily be made between virtues such as love, duty, and loyalty. As examples, A. Love and duty to a parent in conflict with the love and duty to a husband or wife. B. Loyalty to an individual in conflict with loyalty to another individual. Or C. Loyalty to an individual in conflict with loyalty to an organization or society. Let's illustrate with the story of the salesman who worked with George Johnson, where they were faced with a conflict between loyalty in an individual and loyalty to another individual and the organization he represented. George Johnson trained, encouraged, inspired, and financed a salesman whom we will call John Black. George had complete confidence in John. He liked him. He gave him a break. He let him service his best customers, long-established accounts. In the company contract, it was agreed that in the event of termination, the salesman would in no way molest the company's business or interfere with its sales organization. Mr. Johnson gave Black the book Think and Grow Rich, and motivated John to action, the wrong action. John didn't read what was unwritten. His only interest was the acquisition of money. He believed the end justified any means. Because of his negative standards, he responded aggressively with a negative mental attitude. George Johnson is just like a father to me. Yes, I think of him as a father, the salesman said, but at the same time, he secretly planned to transfer the company's customers and sales force to a competing concern, for money. John was welcomed in the homes of his fellow salesmen, for they were unaware of his thoughts or plans. When he called at their homes, he relied upon the honesty and decency of individuals to live up to a promise and not to betray his secret. He would ask, how would you like to double your earnings? How would you like to have greater security? The response would be, sounds good, what's it all about? Black would answer, I don't want anyone to upset the apple cart. Therefore, I'll tell you only if you promise me on your honor to not tell anyone. Do you make a solemn promise? When the answer was yes, he endeavored to entice them over to the competing organization. He tried to neutralize their pangs of conscience by referring to real or imaginary dissatisfactions. The other salesmen were on the spot. On the one hand, they had given John their solemn promise not to tell what he was doing. On the other hand, they knew that what he was doing would be harmful to their employer, and they owed a greater loyalty to George Johnson and the organization he represented. The salesman had the courage to try to clear the cobwebs of John's thinking and to show him what he was contemplating was not right. When he didn't respond, but persisted in his own way, they knew what to do. They gave George Johnson the facts. They chose adherence to the virtue of loyalty to their employer. As Abraham Lincoln once put it, they chose to stand with anyone that stands right, stand with him while he is right, and part from him when he does wrong. The salesmen showed their true characters when they made their decision. They showed that they were men of courage, honesty, and loyalty. They knew how to decide between right and wrong when one virtue was in conflict with another. There are many such conflicts. In your life, you will be faced with the necessity to make decisions in instances where virtues are in conflict with other virtues. And what will your decision be? Perhaps the following will aid you. Do that which your conscience tells you will not develop a guilt feeling. It's the right thing to do. To assist you in coming to the right decision under such circumstances, complete the success quotient analysis in the following chapter. Okay, so that is the end of the chapter and the end of part 4. Now we are almost on to the very last section of the book. In fact, I think there's about 2-3 more chapters and we'll be done. So that's exciting. But I think this, again, is another really good conversation to have, a good point to point out, right? You may be going along this pathway, right, where you're following all the steps, you're doing all the things in the chapters, and everything is, kind of going well, but you may come across some opposition, right? You may come across somebody who is, trying to use the same principles or their own principles for something that is either unvirtuous or dishonest or just wrong, right? Just wrong in general. And that's going to be a test for you, no matter what you're doing, to be able to stand up against that, right? And I think it's a really good rule of thumb that Napoleon Hill points out here is that, okay, when you're faced with this decision to throw your loyalty in one direction or the other, right? Choose the one which gives you the least amount of feelings of guilt, right? Or none at all, right? It's that it's a pretty common question, if I'm ever talking to a client who's got one decision or the other, right? Which will you regret less, right? If you did either of those things, which one do you think would give you feelings of regret? Whichever one that is, don't do that thing, right? And I think too, if you've been following along in the Man's Search for Meaning video series, there's a quote that he has that says, if act as if this were the second time you were given a chance to make this choice, or live as if you, let me see if I can remember this correctly, live as if you've already done this once and the first time you did it incorrectly, right? And that's just to say, basically, evaluate your choices as if you have already done it, or you've already made the choice, and the choice that you made the first time was the incorrect one. How would you adjust that? How would you change your behavior now to be the correct way of choosing, right? And so it's again, you know, I could talk forever on this. I don't have a ton of time to do that, but generally speaking, like I said, your conscience is there for a reason, right? Those feelings of guilt, like he's saying, those are good things. It's like, you know, the feeling of anxiety, and I think I've mentioned this earlier chapters, but it's simply just a survival instinct, right? Both of those things are. Guilt is meant to direct us in a morally correct direction, right? If you're feeling guilty about something, there's a reason for that. Now, the caveat of that is also that, you know, it does depend on what your life has taught you to feel guilty about, right? Because it is possible for you to have had the kind of childhood or the kind of relationships in the past that have almost conditioned you to feel guilty about things, like setting boundaries or feeling guilty about, you know, speaking about your emotions to other people, you know, making your needs known. When those are good and healthy things, right? And so that's the one caveat I'm gonna offer, because, you know, there are times where your feelings of guilt, they're not wrong necessarily, they're just misguided, right? And so that, again, I think is something that is a point to be made. I think especially with the last chapter, and there's been chapters before too, to really work hard to learn yourself, right? Do the research, read the books about codependency, or read the books about anxiety, or read the books about depression. Like, learn about what's going on in your life, and if you're having trouble with that, that's what we're here for too. You know, there is a part of therapy that is it's psychoeducation, right? It's the part of the show where we tell you about things and explain the things that we know, right? And the things that are going on with you. So, you know, again, feel free. Like, we encourage that, you know, and not just a way of, you know, promoting our own businesses and stuff, but really because we know it works, right? We know that what we have to offer is something valuable, especially to people nowadays, with all the anxiety, the depression, and just the way the economy is, the way that society is. It's a tough time to be a human that's paying attention to things. So, I'll end with that. You know, if you know, the rule of thumb being, you know, go in the direction of what the opposite of what your guilt would attach itself to, right? And if you question that, learn about it, right? Like I said, you know, do whatever studies you need to or can. My hope is that these videos are something like that, and, you know, in other video series, there's going to be more books and informational stuff that I hope to disseminate to all of you guys. But really do what you can to learn, right? Do what you can to learn about what you think is going on with you, so that you can trust your feelings of guilt, right? And really follow that solid moral compass, whatever it is for you, right? So with that, I'm gonna let you guys go. I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Leave your comments as always, and I will see you next time. Take care.